All right, Crim 28. Let's knock out Chapter 3, History of Parole and Mandatory Release. The last chapter was the history of probation, where we talked about my dude, John Augustus. And so here are our learning objectives. Okay, so there's a few different types of release. So most prisoners who are being released from prison, again, this is a person who is a sentenced felon and is in a state facility for a felony. In California, that would be a violent felony. So these are people who are in a state prison. Some of them are being released by way of mandatory release, some by way of discretionary release, and some by way of expiration. So what is the difference? A mandatory release. Okay, so a mandatory release is a person who has completed at least the minimum term of their sentence. The minimum of their sentence, okay? Not the maximum, but the minimum. I know it sounds like that's a person who has served every last day they possibly could, but it's not necessarily that person. So, and let me read the definition to you again. Conditional release to a community under determinate sentence that is automatic at the expiration of a minimum term of sentence minus any credited time off for good behavior. Okay, so this is a person who has probably earned some good time. All right. Discretionary release. This is a person that the parole board has evaluated and said this person's done well. They're okay to get released, even though it's kind of early. Indeterminate sentence. Expiration. This is a person who has literally served every single day of their sentence. If you can imagine, in California, if an offender serves every last day of their sentence, this person has been horrible in prison, because it's very, very uncommon for a person to actually serve every day of their sentence. You're all aware of California and our overcrowding issues in our prison system. We get people out. As soon as we can, reasonably, we get them out. So you can only imagine if their time has literally expired, they have been bad. No bueno. Okay? So, parole. That word it's based on a French word that means word of honor. I know, kind of weird when you think of parole. Does the word honor come to your brain? Yeah, but whatever. Anyways, so there are all kinds of different people throughout time who had kind of ideas and little bits and pieces of the whole concept of parole. This first guy, I'm not even going to try and say his last name, Manuel Montesinos. Sounds close. He was in Spain in 1835, and his idea, the thing that he kind of put forward here, was that each prisoner could earn a 1/3 reduction in the term of their sentence through good behavior and positive accomplishments. Okay, kind of makes sense. So they could earn good time. And that's as far back again as 1835. So you got to think of what was the benefit to the prison to encouraging good behavior. There's a lot of benefits to the prison. Number one, your day goes a lot more smooth if your inmates are behaving, right? Number two, you get to clear your beds out and you're not as crowded. And number three, it's easier for the correctional officers, right? You want everything you want. Number one, you want the offenders to get better too. So I mean, it's a win-win-win. It's a win for the community if the person can get back out in the community and work and take care of themselves. So there's a lot of reasons why people were trying to people continue to try to better these offenders so that they can get out and take care of themselves instead of us taking care of them. The second guy, George Michael von Obermayr, okay, Bavarian guy between 1830 and 1862. He had been a prisoner of war, and when he was a prisoner of war, he was beaten and horrifically treated as a prisoner. And he, once he was freed, he wanted to change the prison system because at the time, there was a lot of physical abuse going on in the prisons. So he encouraged reform to abolish corporal punishment in prisons and support upon release from prison. So those are support, meaning like you get paroled and you actually have someone who is there for you after you get out to make sure that you have what you need when you get out. Okay. Alexander Makanichi. I don't know how to say his name either. Sorry, guys. He was another guy. He had something kind of called, it was the Mark system. And ultimately, between Alexander and Sir Walter Crofton, they had some kind of similar ideas. And basically, I like to think of it as like, remember when you were in kindergarten? And oh my gosh, my dog just, go sit down. Go sit down. Sit. Thank you. When you were in kindergarten and there was like the little chart that your teacher put up, and you would go stick a star next to your name every time you did something, or like your math facts, you passed the addition math facts, you got your star. You passed the subtraction math facts, you got a star. And once you got all your stars, then you earned your ticket of leave, is what they called it. So Alexander Makanouchi's was called the Marks system. It was daily tallies, so it was just, it wasn't stars, it wasn't quite that fancy, but it was the mark system, and if you earned a certain number of marks, then you earned your way out. And then Sir Walter Crofton's Irish system was the ticket of leave. Again, he didn't have little stars either, but that's kind of how I describe it because that's how I envision it. But these were guys that were like, okay, what can we do to encourage better behavior among our inmates? And that's kind of what they did, put little charts up, and I'm sure they didn't really do that. I don't think they had those little foil stickers back then, but you know what I mean. So those are kind of the origins of parole. That was the concept, was to encourage better behavior. Here's a quick timeline of the development of parole in the U.S. You can see 1876, Elmira Reformatory. 1910, federal parole began. And remember, we don't have federal parole anymore as of, what did we say? What year was that? That was, I don't remember what year that was, but we don't have that anymore. It was 1984. That was driving me crazy there. So, okay. So, next, justifications for parole. They're pretty common sense, as you can imagine. Reward for good prison conduct. It benefits all of us for inmates to behave while they're in custody. Unfortunately, now, based on the overcrowding that we have in most of our prisons, certainly in California prisons, you don't necessarily have to behave in prison in order to get good time credits. But that's another story. But anyways, that's a justification for parole. Why would we want them to behave well? We just talked about that a couple seconds ago. We want them to, number one, we want them to better themselves. Number two, we want things to go smooth inside the prison so that everybody can just program, take care of business, and move on, that everybody stays safe. We want to get people in and out, and we want them back out in the communities, earning a living for themselves. Post-release supervision, we want to make sure that they have someone when they get out. My friend Brian the murderer had been in custody for 21 years, and he got paroled. He was a lifer. He killed somebody, and he got paroled after 21 years. Imagine the feeling, especially if you've killed someone and you burned some bridges with your family, what it's like to be in custody for 21 years. How much has life changed over 21 years? How much has the world changed in 21 years? And it might have even been a little longer than that. But anyways, getting out and having no one and not knowing where to go, or even, how to use a computer to get a job, to apply for a job, cell phones, things like that. So it's pretty important for them to have that post-release supervision so that they can have someone to kind of help them along the way so that they can survive. Number 3, release from an indeterminate sentence. Indeterminate sentences are those like 25 to life. So, and again, my friend Brian the murderer, his sentence was 15 to life plus, I think, plus 2 years for using personal use of a firearm. So he had basically 17 to life, and then he ultimately did 21. And he was paroled after 21 years because it was a release from an indeterminate sentence. Indeterminate meaning the end of his sentence was not determined. He could have stayed in for the rest of his life, but they released him at 21 years. And then why parole? Reduce the cost of incarceration. It's a heck of a lot cheaper to have people at home in their own houses as opposed to being locked up in prison. And ultimately, it can cost up to $75,000 a year to keep an inmate in custody. $75,000 a year. That's how much tuition is at Stanford. Okay, the medical model. This was pretty popular between 1930 and 1960. Ultimately, the concept of the medical model was the belief that the offender was sick. And sick like as if you had cancer. You have cancer, you can't control that you have cancer. You need medical treatment in order to overcome your illness. So the concept back then, between 1930 and 1960, was that the only reason a person would commit a crime is because they were actually literally sick, and they needed rehabilitation. They needed medical treatment. So they dealt with every offender on an individual basis, trying to figure out why they committed the crime and what can be done to improve the situation. So we have talked about discretionary release. This is something that's done by a parole board. That discretionary release is a parole board has reviewed a person's, the nature of their offense and their performance since they've been in prison, and that parole board will decide if that person is going to get out or not, as opposed to that mandatory release. If they have served that mandatory minimum, the law says they're getting out. Okay? Parole today. 45% of all states practice both indeterminate and determinate sentencing. Now, if you've taken my other classes, certainly if you've taken Intro to Corrections, yes, Crim 20, we've talked a lot about it, but indeterminate sentence is something like 25 to life. The end of that sentence has not been determined. We know that he will be in for at least 25 years, but we don't know when the end of that sentence will be. It could be life. It could be 30 years. We don't know. If someone's in for 3 to 5 years, we know the end of that sentence. Absolutely positively, 5 years, he will be out. The end has been determined. That is a determinate sentence. California uses indeterminate and determinate. Indeterminate, things like murder, 25 to life. Indeterminate, something like vehicle theft, 16 months, 2 or 3 years. There is a releasing authority, that's the parole board in California. Sorry, let's go back here. That's not bad. There we go. Characteristics of parolees. Again, if you look in your book on page 51, there's a really good little chart that basically describes who is on parole. In 1995, it was 90% male, 10% female. In 2013, 88% male, 12% female. So still predominantly, overwhelmingly male. Let's see, white 43%, black 38%, Hispanic 17%. That's in 2013. 30% in 2013 returned to incarceration, did not complete successfully. Pretty sad. So anyways, that means 30% did not do well. So anyways, there's a chart. It'll show you all kinds of stuff about the breakdown. Let's check it out. What are the functions of parole? To enforce restrictions and controls on parolees in the community, providing services to help parolees integrate into non-criminal lifestyles, increasing the public's level of confidence in effectiveness and responsiveness for parole services. You know what a parole agent does, probably, more or less. You know, they meet with the offender on a regular basis, refer them for counseling, refer them to job-type programs, refer them for educational programs, refer them to pretty much whatever they need. Housing, pretty much, yeah, everything. Everything they need, the parole officer basically tries to help them with. And parole is the back doorkeeper of prison. If the prisons get too full, what happens? You know what happens. They start paroling people. People they might not have paroled before. Does that make sense? Yeah, if your prison gets too full, are you going to get pressure to start releasing people? Of course you are. And that's tough. It's tough because you are being pressured to release people that you probably would not normally release. Public safety requirement. This is another term for AB 109. You are going to learn. Oh no, you don't have to do a paper on AB 109, do you? AB 109 is that's great. I think I'm going to have you do a reaction paper on AB 109. Now that I think about it, that's awesome. AB 109. California prisons had to release a significant number of offenders. Prison population control, certainly in California, is a significant problem. Our prisons are too full. Medical parole. So we actually have some people in prison who are in hospital beds in comas. So there is the concept of medical parole, where people would be released on parole because they are basically going to die. Prisoner with a terminal illness who is not a risk to public safety. The tough part here is that unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, offenders have been released before and then recovered. So this is kind of the tough part, but it's also called compassionate release. Some states require supervision after the fact. But think about how much money it costs the state of California, or whatever state, to care for an offender in a medical facility or in a coma. It's a tough call. So anyways, medical parole, something else. Yeah.